A few years ago, I was a university student in Eastern Washington, but dating a girl in Western Washington. I was visiting her for the weekend during the summer when we got into a huge fight around midnight, and I ended up leaving. I decided to head back to my apartment, and I mentioned this for context as to why I was driving through the pass after 1 in the morning. So, I'd never really gone through this pass so late before, and what is usually a very busy stretch of freeway on I-90 was completely empty at this time. I went well over an hour without seeing a single vehicle going either way, so naturally I was driving way too fast. At the time I had a 73 Chevy Nova. It wasn't quite the classic, but it had power and a complete lack of AC. Even though it was late at night, and the combination of a warm summer night and the large amount of heat that bleeds through some of the engine meant that I had my windows down, and I was still sweating. Not far into the east side of the mountains, around 1:30 I would guess, I hit a long stretch of straight road that doesn't really have an on-ramp or way to get into the freeway. When suddenly a set of headlights appeared behind me, something like maybe 200 feet back. I sort of glanced back at the lights, puzzled as to where that vehicle could have possibly come from. I noticed that despite the fact that I was absolutely hauling the lights, they were gaining on me. I decided to switch lanes and slow down a bit so it could pass. After a moment, the vehicle, now only half that distance, moved over behind me into the same lane. This is also when I began to panic. I mean, I'm in the middle of nowhere, hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour, and now I've got some aggressive driver running up on me. I watched too as those lights got closer. 60 feet, 50 feet, 40. In seconds it was upon me. It got so close too that I even braced against the steering wheel, expecting to get rear-ended by the vehicle going much faster than me now. I watched in my rearview mirror in horror as those headlights blasted right into the back of my vehicle, and suddenly everything just froze. Like, quite literally. Nothing physically hit me, but the whole vehicle frosted over and I could now see my breath. I hit the brakes and I did my best to pull over despite not being able to see through the windshield. And every hair on my body was now standing on end. I got out of my vehicle and paced back and forth, examining my car, which was already starting to defrost as steams of water poured down it. There was no damage to my back bumper that I could see, and absolutely no sign of whatever vehicle had hit me. Eventually, I calmed down enough to get back into the car and drive the rest of the way back up, wake my roommates, and explain what just happened. And the next time that I drove through that area in the daylight, right about where I think the ghost car had actually hit me, there, sitting on the side of the road, was a very old wooden cross, somewhat overgrown, that had been there for some time. I'm a female college student, and I live with my family in a huge apartment in a big city. But where I come from, it's pretty normal to just go to college near your house. And this all happened on a weekend when my family and I had planned a sort of trip abroad, but last minute I had an exam rescheduled for that Monday, so I decided not to go. So it's Thursday, and my parents and siblings are leaving for the airport, and a guy that they usually hire is taking them to the airport. My mum tells me that my maid is staying with me for the weekend and that I should call her if I need anything. I say goodbye and I go back to studying. So it's now Thursday at around 9 p.m. and I'm studying in the living room with my boyfriend. And my maid tells me that it's getting late and that she's going to bed, so I tell her that I'm going to go to bed soon too. An hour later my boyfriend leaves and it's now around maybe just after 10:30 and I'm getting ready for bed. I grab my dog, small Yorkie, and take her to my room to sleep with me. It's about 11 now, and I'm in bed looking at my notes when my dog starts growling at the door. I tell her to be quiet because Yorkers are nervous and bark all the time, let me tell you. Well, at least mine does anyway. So, after she's silent, I get this sort of adrenaline rush and stay very still, and I then hear footsteps in the corridor. The floor is made of wood, so when I hear a specific creak, a sound of wood bending, I know the steps are getting near my room. So at first I think it's probably my maid making sure my boyfriend didn't stay over, but when the footprints stopped at my door, I really started to freak out a bit. I was even compelled to say my maid's name. He's not here, you can come in and check. But somehow I just knew that it wasn't her. So I called my boyfriend and I told him that somebody was in my house. He tells me to put on some shoes and check the other rooms. I really don't want to, but I'm also not going to sleep until I'm sure that there's nobody here, so I eventually find enough courage and I put my shoes on and start walking over slowly towards my sister's room and checking with my phone light, but I see that it's empty. I check the bathroom and that's empty too. My parents' room, empty. By this time I'm getting a bit more relaxed because I think I must have imagined it. Then I go to my parents' bathroom and it's also empty. So I walk to their house closet and I scan the room with my phone light when I shed light on a human figure, and it was obviously not my maid, but I say her name and this tall muscular body answers, no, it's the driver that took my parents to the airport. I freeze and try to act cool, but he invents some petty excuse like I was checking the windows were closed. I tell him that it's late and he eventually leaves the house, and then I called my parents to verify his excuse. He was obviously lying, but he had the audacity to ask me via WhatsApp if I want him to drive me to college tomorrow. I never did see him again after this, but I often wonder, what was he doing, just standing outside my door like that?
Many years ago, when I must have been in about grade 5 or 6, my parents started working more, leading me to having to catch the bus and walk the rest of the way back to home. There was nothing bad about this, and I enjoyed the walks too. I'd been doing it for about a year, and each day I noticed the same guy parked in the driveway with this dark blue ute, and almost every time a cigarette in his mouth as well. I saw him 2 days in a row the first time, and thought nothing of him. A few days passed without me seeing him. Then the next week, I walked past the house, and his car was there with no one in it. I felt uneasy walking past it, though, and I noted a camera poorly hidden away just in front of the steering wheel. I pretended not to notice it, but in my head, I knew exactly why it was there. And for the rest of the week, the camera was there. At the end of the week, he'd sit in his car and check his watch as soon as I'd walk by. And I knew that he was trying to figure out the time that I came past him. I wanted to take a different route home, but I couldn't really do much else, and the only way would inevitably result in me walking past the house every time. And for maybe a month, he'd be sitting in his car, staring at me each time. I still don't know if he thought that I couldn't see him, because he was bad at being discreet. But then, one day, he was leaning on his car door, and as I walked past, he said something along the lines of, "Hey mate, you need a ride home?" And obviously I said no. He kept on trying to get a yes from me, but I didn't stop refusing. I could tell that he was getting mad, and he could tell that I knew it too, so he calmed down and said sorry. Next day, I see his ute drive up behind me. He slows down as he comes next to me and rolls down his window, asking me if I want to ride again. He drove off the first time. I said no this time, and it goes maybe a week or two without seeing him. After, I thought that I wouldn't see him again, but then he drives past again. He asked the exact same question, and when I refused, he told me to just get in the car. I said that I'm not going to get in, and he can leave me alone. He changed his tone a lot and said that he's got a gun. I lived in a small Australian city, and the chances of him having a gun are pretty much next to zero, and it was easy to tell that he was trying to scare me. He then played it off as a joke after I was unfazed and leaned over and opened the door. Get in, mate. It's much better in here than out there when it's so hot, right? I've got air conditioning and it's like 35 degrees outside. You'd probably know about stranger danger and all that, right? But I promise, that's not who I am. Come on, hop in. I remember that word for word, and it scares me to think about it to this day. No, my house is right there. Just leave me alone, please, I said. The only problem was, my house was actually about a half a kilometre away at least. I proceeded to walk up the random house driveway and knock on the door. I had no idea who these people were. He stared as I waited for the door to open. I heard the doorknob turn, and before the person could say anything, I bumped past them and went inside. Now that I think of it, it was probably just as dangerous to enter a random person's house, other than a random person's car. But the man's expression changed and he sped off. That is, after the house owner glared at him. The owner was actually a really nice old woman, and I said that he tried to convince me to get into his car. She called my parents, and I waited outside of her house for them to arrive. My mum was really grateful, and my dad was pretty much in shock. My mum then constantly visited the old lady, as she lived alone and she wanted to be nice. And I never really thought about how lucky I was that the house that I entered was not the wrong one to go into in the first place. I try not to think about the whole experience because it genuinely terrifies me. I don't know what happened to the man because after that I never saw him again. And I definitely don't miss him.